Our first speaker today is going to be Jeremy Alexander. He's a research fellow at Victoria University in Melbourne, and he's currently working in conjunction with the statistical provider Champion Data, along with Australian Football League, to measure game trends and some tactical team behavior within that league. His background is in performance analysis in sports, with a focus on combining player tracking data and match event to better understand how player positioning impacts match play. And today his talk is titled Quantifying Congestion in Australian Rules Football. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeremy.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll just share my screen. So you guys can see that all right? Can see this screen all right? Yep, good to go. Okay, brilliant. So thanks for allowing me to present today. As Kevin mentioned, I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. I work at Victoria University as a research fellow. Also hold applied roles with Champion Data, which is the main statistical provider here in Australia that covers most of the prominent sports and the Australian Football League. So today I'm just going to be talking about player congestion in Australian rules football and how it impacts match play. A bit of background, Australian football is a popular invasion sport played with two teams of 18 players. Matches are divided into 4 quarters, each of 20 minutes of playing time. Gameplay has experienced a general trend towards a faster game speed, although as this has occurred, there's some angst that contemporary football has suffered from more defensive styles of play. So a key component of this is greater player congestion around the ball. Now, it's been stated that this increases contested match play. It also limits the time and space afforded to a player, which could induce skill errors and stifles free-flowing ball movement. So we have a look at some notational analysis to see how congestion impacts match play. We have this figure here, it's just over the last 20 years. So this is the count of possessions that are contested. So that's just under pressure or in dispute. So you can see here, the last 10 years, there's been a dramatic increase here. There's also been an increase in the tackle count over the same time period and an increase in skill error rate. This is also impacted here in your overall disposal rate. So disposals are just passes in Australian football. So I can see it's not just the total number of possessions that's increasing, it's the overall passing, the efficiency is decreased as well over this time period. Some researchers have also linked increased player congestion with a decrease in scoring. So we can see here over the last 20 years, scoring's steadily declined. And then that's sort of picked up the last 5 years where you sort of see a dramatic decrease here. To negate this trend or arrest it, the AFL are the lawmakers here, and they've implemented major rule changes or implementations over the last 20-year period. Won't go through all of them here because there's so many, but essentially they surround 2 aims. That's to reduce player congestion and elicit a more free-flowing game, and increase scoring by stimulating more attacking styles of play. So to determine congestion in Australian football is typically done by video analysis. So this is pretty basic, just involves a human coder that counts the raw count of players within a 5-meter radius at 15-second intervals. So it's really unfeasible to scale this type of analysis because it's laborious, inefficient, and prone to error. It also precludes a continuous measure of congestion because you're only taking 15-second intervals. And it's also difficult to determine the level of congestion a player experiences when he's passing or disposing of the ball. So not to be too critical of this research, they were just really constrained by the technology they had. So the advent of player tracking technologies provides us with a suitable data source to overcome these obstacles. So to achieve this, we take the location of teammates and opponents and process them with certain machine learning algorithms to quantify the characteristics of congestion more effectively. So some of the more common approaches with machine learning algorithms is unsupervised learning, which could be clustering. So could use this to determine the number of players within higher density compared to those in lower density at each point in time. A second approach could be supervised learning, where we could take a classification model and then we could give a more nuanced representation of congestion during disposals. So we utilize both these approaches in the analysis. I'll just talk about why we took two. So the first one was an unsupervised approach. This was to determine or quantify congestion continuously. That is at each unique point in time in a match. So this determined the number of players situated in higher player density compared to low player density. But for this output, you only get two labels. So if we're taking a clustering approach here, so they just determine if the player is inside congestion or outside congestion. So you just have that binary output. But when fans and commentators normally talk about player congestion, it's focused on the ball carrier who's disposing of the ball. So this is where the clustering model can't provide that. So we take a supervised approach where we can classify a more nuanced description of congestion when a player is passing the ball. And this gives us more representative understanding of how congestion could actually impact match play. So to achieve this, we can train more nuanced labels. So they could involve disposing in high congestion, nearby congestion, or low congestion. So the data we included in this analysis was collected from the 2019 and 2021 Australian football regular seasons that just excluded finals. Matches were played at a single stadium, so 56 in total. Field dimensions were roughly 160 metres by 130 metres. Each match is undertaken with 4 20-minute quarters, and we used 10 Hertz LBS tracking devices. Periods of play that lost the positioning on one or more players were omitted from the study. So the match events were recorded by champion data. So they include kicks, marks, and handballs, and they're recorded to the nearest 10th of a second. Disposals in Australian football is just the total number of kicks and handballs. So they're the way you can pass the ball legally. The player tracking data was synchronized with this match event data using timestamps in both data sets. And this was used to infer the location of the ball. So we don't have a true XY coordinate of the ball. And this was also specified to the nearest 10th of a second. So how field positions are typically split up in Australian rules football is into 4 zones. So if this team here is attacking from the left to the right, you've got your 250-metre arcs and the centre of the ground. So this here, you got your defensive 50, defensive mid, attacking mid, and forward 50. So our first model was the unsupervised one, which was to determine congestion continuously. So to achieve this, we took a clustering technique. So typical approaches such as K-means or Gaussian mixture models aren't suitable for this aim. So that's because these approaches, you have a fixed number of clusters is the main one, and they also group points by the centroid. So you can see here, these are 3 separate time points in Australian football. And at each time point, we may need a flexible number of clusters to group players into. So the first one, we only have 1 discernible cluster. The second time point, we have multiple, and then a third one, we may need no clusters. So you really need an approach that is flexible in how we group players into, and density-based clustering techniques meet these requirements. So they include DB scan or optics. So these 2 algorithms cluster players by reachability. So essentially, you provide a set radius, and then to be considered a cluster, you have a minimum number of points within that set radius. So we use the optics model for our study. It's just a little bit different to DB scan in that it can handle varying densities. So this model requires a minimum number of points within a specified radius. And then there's 2 parameters that this model used. So they include your EPS or epsilon, which is just the minimum distance or radius to be considered a cluster of congestion. and then the minimum number of points that had to be within that radius to be considered a cluster. So after a few trial and testing phases, we selected 7.5 meter radius as our threshold, and then that radius had to contain at least 4 players to be considered a cluster of congestion. So this is just an output from the model in this figure here. So if the model did classify the players within congestion, they were considered core points. So if it was a core point, that they were labeled 0 through n, so 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And players not assigned to a cluster were considered as noise. So that's always designated as a -1 here. So these integers aren't really practical. So to convert them, something that we could use, we translated these into separate labels. So we did this, the core points or the clusters of congestion were relabeled primary congestion if it had the highest count of players. If more than one cluster was identified, the lesser number of players within that was converted to secondary congestion. And finally, if players were labeled as noise, they were translated to outside congestion. So they were our 3 output labels. So we passed this model to each unique point in time in a match. We also outputted or computed the mean and standard deviation to determine the proportion of players within each cluster. We compared this across the 2019 and 2021 seasons and across the 4 field positions, so your D50 through to your forward 50, and the 4 separate quarters within a match. So this is the output when we're just looking at the 2 seasons within each cluster. As you can see, there's very limited change between the 2 seasons. If anything, there's maybe a small decrease in primary congestion and a small increase outside congestion, but once we account for the standard deviation, it's quite small. When we look at the field position, so the defensive 50 was in your back half of the ground, and then forward 50 is towards your attacking end. So when we move the ball towards your attacking end, you can sort of see primary congestion increase a little bit, and then outside congestion decrease. But again, the findings are quite small. And finally, when we're looking at each quarter within a match, the proportion of players within primary congestion slightly decreases, and the outside congestion slightly increases. So the limitations with this model, we only get a binary output. So a player can only be identified as inside or outside congestion. And it also doesn't account for the ball carrier when we want to assess the level of congestion that a player may face. It just determines the density of players independent of where the ball is. So if you look at this one here, this player here with the red X is disposing of the ball. So if we took this approach, he would be identified as secondary congestion, which isn't really practical. So a more representative measure would take a categorized description of the congestion that they face and give you a more nuanced approach, such as high, medium. So a supervised approach was our second model, and that would be trained to classify the level of player faces when he's disposing of the ball. So to undertake this, we got expert analysts from Champion Data, label multiple data sets, multiple disposals, sorry. So roughly 2,000 disposals were in our training data set, and then they labeled it in 3 separate disposal labels here. So they were either high congestion, which is multiple players within 0, nearby congestion, which was 0 to 10 meters, but the player did have space to move into, and finally low. That was when there were 1 or fewer active players within 10 meters of the ball. To ensure that the training data set was valid and reliable, we undertook a blind independent analysis. So we got another analyst to tag them, tag the disposals independently and compare them with the previously analyzed disposals just to make sure that it was consistent. So we developed a classification model to classify the same levels of congestion. To achieve this, we developed a range of spatial temporal features using the tracking data. And they mainly surrounded player counts. So this top half here, we split two radiuses around the ball at each point in time. So a 5-meter radius and a 10-meter radius. And then the 4 separate features was the total count within each one of these radii, and then just focusing on the number of defenders. So if you've got teammates, high number of teammates within close proximity, you may not be in congestion. So it's really to differentiate between the number of defenders there. The second set of features, we took the same radius, but split it up into 4 quadrants, and that was just determined based on the direction of the ball carrier. So frontal, to the right, behind, and to the left. Finally, the last feature was the area that intersects with the player. So if you're on the boundary here, you have less room to move. So just determining how much space a player has to move within when he's on the boundary. So every analysis was done in Python. To determine the classification model, we utilized the lazy predict repository, which is just a bunch of classifiers. We selected the random forest because it had the highest accuracy at base model testing. We split the data into test train data sets of 80-20. We parameters using the grid search in Python, optimize the parameters. We removed the last feature because it just didn't attribute to the model, didn't contribute. We assessed the performance using standard metrics such as precision recall and F1 score, and determined the feature importance using SHAP values. Also computed confusion matrix and ROC curves to assess model performance. Once we achieved this, we passed the classification model to every disposal within the 2019 and 2021 seasons, and then same as the continuous model, computed the mean and standard deviation to understand the breakdown within the 3 disposal labels. Also compared across the seasons, field positions, and same quarters. So these are our feature importance here with the SHAP values. So this is essentially determining how a model makes its decisions. So we look at our global feature importance here. So these are the features that actually influenced each disposal label. So these are the immediate player counts and immediate defender counts and extended. So just the total count within that 5 and 10 meter radius. When we look at the individual labels here to understand the direction of how it was making its decisions, if these features displayed a reduced count, it was more likely to classify the disposal within low congestion. And conversely, if the features displayed a higher count, then it was more likely to classify that disposal within high congestion. So we assessed the model performance with the confusion matrix here. So the model was significantly better at classifying disposals within high and low congestion, and then it sort of fell down a little bit nearby congestion. So you can see here, the model predicts sort of evenly split with nearby. That is, it was classifying it within low and high congestion, which sort of makes sense because disposals aren't in these 3 separate categories. It's probably more continuous where a disposal could go in high congestion or low congestion, but still overall not too bad. This is stipulated here in the ROC curves and your precision recall curves. So high and low, pretty good. So if one's perfect, these are at 0.96, and then it sort of falls down a little bit when it's classifying disposals nearby congestion. So when we pass this model to each disposal across the 2 seasons, we can see the number of, or the proportion of disposals within high decrease across the season here. So, you know, a 3 to 4% decrease in disposals within high congestion. Conversely, outside and nearby congestion increase over that same time period. So if you just focus on in high congestion and nearby, we can sort of see that a large chunk of gameplay or a large chunk of disposals has some form of congestion around the ball carrier, so greater than 60%. When we compare across the field positions, so defensive 50 again, right through to your attacking end to your forward 50, we can see a similar trend across both seasons. That is, once you move towards your attacking end, the number of disposals in high congestion increases, which makes sense. Players put more pressure on the ball carrier once it gets towards the end that they're defending at. We can see a similar trend in nearby congestion. So when you go from D50 to the middle part of the ground, and then conversely, outside congestion drops off. Where it altered a little bit was in the forward 50. So this is most likely due to set shots on goal. So if a player marks the ball or gets a free kick in the forward 50, they're allowed to shoot it on goal unimpeded by the opposition player. So that's sort of why we have an increase in disposals outside and a decrease here nearby. When we have a look at the four separate, across the quarters here, so as the match progresses, again, similar trend across both seasons. That is, as the match progresses, there's a steady decline in the number of disposals within high congestion. So this could be due to player fatigue or increased scoring margins. So if there is sort of blowout margins, then the intensity at the end of the match isn't the same as what it was at the start of the match. So the main findings from the two modelling approaches we undertook, the continuous model determined that at least 25% of game time records players within some form of congestion. That's either primary or secondary. And that didn't really change across the two seasons. When we looked at the classification model, we could see a considerable decline in disposals within high congestion across the two seasons. So this suggests that players coalesce in similar manners throughout a match, so continuously, but there's less pressure on the ball carrier in the 2021 season. So this could suggest that the rule changes that the AFL are implementing are having an impact on player congestion. If you have a look at the scoring from the latest season, we can see that 2021 was pretty similar to 2019. So, which suggests that scoring in and of itself has a limited impact. That congestion has a limited impact on scoring, which is understandable given invasion sports are complex. Scoring is probably likely multifactorial. So more analysis is required to determine if scoring can be increased. But just the future directions, we could pass the classification model to understand differences between teams, and also if any variation exists within a season to determine if other contextual variables impact congestion, such as the weather, for instance. Finally, I'll just finish on the practical applications. So given we had pretty good accuracy and fit with both models, we can safely say that these can be used to inform rule changes from the AFL Commission, also compare across similarities and differences of game styles between teams, and quantify any game trends in match play that occur over time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So at this point, I'm just gonna bring it up to the rest of the audience if anybody has any questions for Jeremy. I see Mark has his hand up. Mark, you want to ask?
Sure. Yeah, really nice talk, Jeremy. Really interesting. Actually, the last couple of slides mostly address what I wanted to know, which was, what are sort of the, implications of what you're doing aside from just characterizing congestion in Australian rules football. But I was curious if you had any thoughts about how individual teams can use this information in, addressing, strategic or tactical issues, whether that makes
Yeah,
any
sure.
sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah, so we have an output there where we take a whole, like an overview of the number of disposals within each disposal label, but you can go another step below that and look at individual player analysis and look at player roles. So if one player sort of is an inside player, that's they're mainly getting disposals within high congestion, you can start to look at individual player roles and how this model impacts that, and tailor your tactical analysis and also recruiting for those models.
Great. There's a question from Rachel. Rachel, do you want to ask your question?
The way we've been doing it, Kevin, is that you can just sort of read the question that's posted. Just kind of keep it.
Okay, that's fine. All right, I'll do it that way.
Sorry, Rachel.
Just to make it
Unless
easy.
you want to ask Rachel, you're with us right now.
Rachel, are you unmuted? You want to talk?
Sure. So I'm just wondering, with your decrease in high congestion between 2019 and 2021, if you considered any role that COVID-19 may have played in that, with players maybe just kind of inadvertently staying further away from each other than they would in a typical year.
Yeah, that's a left field response. I don't think it's quite that. There was a lot of esoteric rule changes at the end of 2019. So one of those was when a player marks the ball, you can't tackle them. You have to allow them like 10, 15 seconds to dispose of it before the umpire calls play on. And then last year, the man on the mark was allowed to move around laterally, so he could close down the space either side. But a rule change was he had to remain absolutely stationary to do that. And if you moved, there was a 50-meter penalty. So rather than press the ball carrier, teams sort of a bit more defensive and they sit back a lot more. So rather than increasing congestion around the ball and give away like a 50-meter penalty, they sort of sit in their defensive half a lot more and just wait for the team to move it quickly and turn it over. So yeah, so the AFL have impacted their first aim, which was to reduce congestion, but scoring is still pretty subdued. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thanks. Just to speed things up, I'll ask, there's a question from Barbara on the Q&A, wondering if reducing congestion impacts the number of penalties called. Just trying to see what other impacts this congestion might have.
Yeah, so it's typically increasing game speed, so allows the ball to sort of transition a lot quicker if there's less density around it. And then some people suggest if you do this, you could increase scoring because the ball you can attack a lot quicker. In return, in account of free kicks and stuff, they're relatively stable. So I suppose there's less free kicks paid there, but then there's other free kicks paid elsewhere, so it all evens out.
Great, thanks. And I had a question. What's kind of the denominator here? So you were looking at the congestion during these disposals. Do you have any sense of the rate of congestion in these three categories outside of those times?
So that was every disposal. You mean like other seasons, like previous years, or
no, just out, during regular match play, what is the like standard rate of being in these high clustered areas versus low clustered areas?
I think, so this one, I think it's sort of found around 60% of match play was within some form of congestion. That was in like congestion is pretty nearby or it's high. Mm-hmm. So rarely was a player sort of in open space and had time to make a decision without an opponent directly near him. So I think this was like less than 40% or even 35% or lower. So a lot of game time is within some sort of player congestion in Australian rules football. This is probably just due because there's so many players on the ground.
Great. Thanks. Any other last questions?
We should probably move on.